Your Honor, my client is asking for probation. The defense attorney had barely finished the sentence when the man standing at the podium beside him shook his head and leaned into the microphone. I don't need probation, he said. I just need my license back. The courtroom went still. I sat behind the bench, looking down at the defendant. He was 32 years old, wearing a wrinkled gray shirt that looked like it had been pulled from the back seat of a car. His hands rested on the edge of the podium like he owned the room. Behind him, 12 jurors watched quietly. To my right, the bailiff shifted his weight. I tapped my pen once on the sentencing file. Mr. Cole, I said, keeping my voice even, your attorney is speaking for you. Let him finish. He shrugged and leaned back. Doesn't matter, he said. This whole thing's being blown out of proportion anyway. I let the silence sit in the room. His attorney glanced sideways at him, jaw tight. Your Honor, the attorney said again carefully, Mr. Cole understands the seriousness of the situation, but he believes probation would allow him to maintain employment, and the defendant laughed softly. A few jurors looked up. His attorney stopped talking. I folded my hands on the bench. Mr. Cole, I said. He looked up at me with the same casual expression. This is a sentencing hearing, I continued. You were convicted by a jury 2 weeks ago of felony DUI causing death. The word death hung in the room. The defendant shifted his stance but didn't lower his eyes. It was an accident, he said. Across the aisle, a woman in the front row tightened her grip on a folded tissue. She didn't speak, but her shoulders trembled. I watched the defendant for another moment. Then I looked down at the file again. Counsel, I said to the defense attorney, you may continue. The attorney cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly. Your Honor, Mr. Cole has no prior felony convictions. He has maintained steady employment for several years. We believe a structured probation program with alcohol monitoring and community service would serve the interests of justice while allowing him to, the defendant interrupted again. This is insane, he said, shaking his head. People get probation for this all the time. The jurors stared at him. I raised one hand slightly. The bailiff took a step forward. Mr. Cole, I said, you will not interrupt your attorney again. He lifted both hands slightly like he was surrendering. Fine, he muttered. The courtroom settled. The prosecutor stood slowly from the other table. Your Honor, she said, walking toward the lectern, the state opposes probation. She placed a thin folder on the podium and opened it. This case involves a blood alcohol level of 0.18, more than twice the legal limit, she said. The defendant ran a red light at 57 miles per hour and struck another vehicle broadside. The jurors sat motionless. The defendant stared at the ceiling. The prosecutor continued. The victim, Daniel Harper, was 24 years old. She turned slightly toward the gallery. Mr. Harper died at the scene. The room was quiet enough to hear the air vent humming overhead. The defendant shifted his feet. Then he leaned toward the microphone again. I didn't mean to kill anybody, he said. The prosecutor stopped speaking and looked at him. I lifted my gaze from the bench. Mr. Cole, I said quietly. He looked up. You will remain silent. He rolled his eyes. For a moment I considered speaking again. Instead, I nodded once to the prosecutor. She continued. Your Honor, the state would also like to introduce one additional exhibit for the court's consideration before sentencing. The defense attorney frowned slightly. Your Honor, he said. I looked at him. Proceed. The prosecutor opened the folder and removed a small flash drive. The exhibit is dashboard camera footage from the arresting officer's patrol vehicle. The defendant shifted. That's not relevant anymore, he said quickly. The prosecutor ignored him. It captures the defendant's statements approximately 3 minutes after the collision. The defense attorney leaned toward his client. The defendant whispered something sharply. I watched the exchange. Then I nodded toward the courtroom clerk. Play the exhibit. The lights dimmed slightly as the monitor on the wall flickered on. The video began with flashing red and blue lights. A wrecked sedan sat sideways in the intersection. The patrol officer's voice came through the speakers. Sir, stay where you are. The defendant appeared on screen, stumbling slightly near the front of a damaged pickup truck. The jurors leaned forward. The officer asked, have you been drinking tonight? The defendant laughed. The exact same laugh he had used in my courtroom. On the screen he answered, yeah, but I drive better buzzed anyway. A few jurors exchanged glances. The video continued. The officer walked past the defendant toward the other vehicle. For a moment the camera pointed at the crushed driver's door. Then the officer's voice changed. Dispatch, we need an ambulance immediately. Back in the courtroom, no one moved. The video ended. The lights came back up. The defendant shifted at the podium. That doesn't show anything, he said. The defense attorney stared down at the table. I looked at the jury. Every single one of them was watching the defendant. Then the prosecutor spoke again. Your Honor, the state also requests permission to read a brief statement from the victim's mother. I nodded. The woman in the front row stood slowly. She walked to the podium without looking at the defendant. The bailiff adjusted the microphone. She unfolded a single sheet of paper. Her voice was quiet. "My son was driving home from work that night," she said. The defendant stared down at his shoes. She continued reading. "He called me 20 minutes earlier to say he'd be home soon." Her hands trembled slightly. The jurors watched silently. "He never made it." She folded the paper and stepped back from the microphone. The bailiff guided her back to her seat. For several seconds, the courtroom remained completely still. No one coughed. No papers moved. The defendant looked up again. Then he said something that made the room freeze. "I said I was sorry." The woman in the front row didn't turn around, but the jurors did, every one of them. I placed both hands on the bench. "Mr. Cole," I said. He looked at me. "This is your final opportunity to address the court before sentencing." He nodded slightly. Then he stepped closer to the microphone. "I just think 15 years is crazy," he said. His attorney closed his eyes briefly. "I mean, people make mistakes," the defendant continued. "It's not like I planned it." The jurors stared at him. He shrugged again. "So yeah," he finished. "Probation makes more sense." The room went quiet again. I looked down at the sentencing guidelines in the file, then I closed it. The bailiff straightened slightly near the wall. "Mr. Cole," I said. He looked up. "You were given every opportunity during this trial to take responsibility for your actions." He shifted his stance. I continued. "A jury reviewed the evidence. They heard testimony from witnesses, officers, and experts." He stared back at me without speaking. "The verdict was guilty." I lifted the sentencing order. "In this state, felony DUI causing death carries a maximum sentence of 15 years. The defendant's expression changed slightly, just slightly. His attorney placed a hand on the table. I signed the document. The pen made a soft scratch across the paper. Then I looked directly at the defendant. "Mr. Cole," I said. The bailiff stepped forward slightly. "I am sentencing you to 15 years in the Department of Corrections." The defendant's mouth opened. His attorney lowered his head. In the gallery, the woman in the front row covered her face. The bailiff moved to the defendant's side and placed a hand on his arm. "Court is adjourned," I said. The gavel struck once. As the bailiff guided the defendant toward the side door, I closed the file and rested my hand on the bench. In 25 years on that bench, I had heard many people ask for probation. But that afternoon was the first time I heard someone ask for it after laughing at the life they had taken. The bailiff's hand stayed on Mr. Cole's arm as he turned him toward the side door beside the jury box. For a moment, the defendant didn't move. Then he twisted slightly and looked back at the podium where he had been standing only seconds earlier. "You're serious?" he said. The bailiff didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip and guided him forward. The courtroom door opened with a dull metallic sound. Mr. Cole looked over his shoulder again, this time toward the jury. "You people think you're perfect," he said. The jurors didn't react. One man in the second row folded his hands on the rail in front of him and stared straight ahead. The bailiff leaned closer to the defendant. "Keep walking," he said quietly. They disappeared through the door. The room stayed silent after it closed. The defense attorney slowly gathered the files from his table. He moved carefully, stacking papers that no longer mattered. Across the aisle, the prosecutor remained standing. The woman in the front row sat motionless, her hands still covering her face. I watched the courtroom for another moment. No one spoke. Finally, I leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Members of the jury," I said. They looked up. "You are released from further service in this case." The foreperson nodded once. Chairs moved softly as they stood. The bailiff at the back door opened it for them, and they began filing out quietly. A few of them glanced toward the gallery as they passed. One juror paused for a second near the rail. Then he continued walking. Within a minute, the jury box was empty. The defense attorney approached the podium again. He didn't look toward the gallery. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "thank you for the court's time." I nodded once. He closed his briefcase and walked toward the same side door the bailiff had used. The prosecutor gathered her folder next. She paused briefly at the counsel table, then turned toward the gallery. The victim's mother was still seated. The prosecutor walked over and spoke softly to her. I couldn't hear the words. But the woman nodded. After a moment, they both stood and walked toward the exit. The courtroom began to empty. Papers rustled. Chairs shifted. The clerk shut down the monitor used for the video evidence. The screen went black. I remained seated behind the bench. The bailiff returned through the side door a minute later. He walked to his position beside the wall and straightened his uniform. "Defendant is in custody," he said. I nodded. He glanced briefly toward the now empty gallery, then back at the bench. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I reached forward and closed the sentencing file one last time. The sound of the folder shutting echoed softly across the quiet courtroom. I rested my hand on the top of it. In courtrooms, people often come in believing the law will bend for them. Sometimes they think a good lawyer will fix everything. Sometimes they think an apology will erase what happened. but the law doesn't move for laughter, and it doesn't forget the moment someone chooses to get behind a wheel after drinking. I stood from the bench. The chair rolled slightly backward behind me. The bailiff opened the door behind the bench. As I stepped through it, the courtroom lights dimmed and the heavy wooden doors at the front closed quietly. The case of State v. Cole was over. But the silence that followed that sentencing stayed with me long after the courtroom emptied. I stepped into the hallway behind the courtroom, and the door closed with the heavy sound that old courthouse doors always make. For a moment I stood there, holding the sentencing file in my hand. Through the wall I could still hear faint movement inside the courtroom, chairs sliding, quiet voices, the slow routine of a room returning to normal after something serious had just happened. The bailiff walked out a few seconds later. He paused beside me. "Transport's on the way," he said. I nodded. Down the hall, 2 sheriff's deputies were waiting near the holding area door. Behind that door sat Mr. Cole. Only a few minutes earlier, he had been standing at a courtroom podium asking for probation. Now he was sitting on a metal bench in a concrete room with his hands cuffed in front of him. The difference between those 2 moments is sometimes only a few sentences spoken from the bench. The bailiff adjusted the papers in his hand. "Victim's family is still downstairs," he said. I looked toward the end of the hallway where the elevator doors were. "They usually stay a few minutes," I said. He nodded. Neither of us spoke again for a moment. Then the transport deputies arrived. They walked down the hallway carrying a set of waist chains. One of them glanced toward the courtroom door. "Sentencing done?" he asked. "Yes," the bailiff answered. 15. The deputy nodded once. They went through the holding area door. A minute later, I heard the sound of the chain belt locking, then footsteps. Mr. Cole came out between the deputies. His hands were cuffed to the chain around his waist. He looked smaller now than he had at the podium. Defendants often do once the courtroom moment is over. He saw me standing near the hallway and stopped walking. One of the deputies nudged him forward. "Keep moving." But he hesitated for a second. Then he looked at me. "That's really 15 years, he asked. The hallway was quiet. The deputies didn't speak. I held the sentencing file in my hand. "Yes," I said. For the first time that afternoon, his expression changed. The confidence he had carried at the podium was gone. He looked down the hallway toward the elevator, then back at me. "I didn't think it would actually happen," he said. One of the deputies tightened his grip on the chain. "That's enough," he said. They guided him forward again. As they walked toward the elevator, Mr. Cole looked once more toward the courtroom door behind me, the same door he had walked through weeks earlier when the trial started. The elevator opened. The deputies led him inside. Just before the doors closed, he spoke again, this time quieter. "I should have just stayed quiet." The doors slid shut. The hallway went silent again. The bailiff exhaled slowly. "That happens more than people think," he said. I nodded. Many defendants walk into a courtroom believing the worst thing that can happen is a lecture. Sometimes they believe the judge will see things their way. Sometimes they believe the jury misunderstood them. And sometimes they believe that asking for probation will undo the moment that brought them there. But a courtroom doesn't run on what someone wishes had happened. It runs on what actually did. The bailiff pushed open the door behind the bench so I could return to chambers. Inside, my desk lamp was still on. The courtroom calendar sat open beside it. Another case waited for the afternoon session. I placed the sentencing file into the completed stack. The folder landed with a quiet thud. One more case finished. One more family walking out of the courthouse with a sentence that couldn't bring anyone back. I sat down at the desk and looked at the clock on the wall. 10 minutes until the next hearing. In court, the work never stops. But every once in a while, a moment stays with you longer than the others. And the sound of that gavel falling after Mr. Cole asked for probation was one of those moments. I sat there for a moment longer after placing the file on the stack. The hallway outside chambers had gone quiet again. Most of the afternoon traffic had moved downstairs to the other courtrooms. Through the small window in my office door, I could see the bailiff returning to his station inside the courtroom. He straightened the chairs near the rail and checked the microphone at the podium. Routine movements. Courtrooms run on routine. The calendar on my desk listed the next hearing at 2:30. Another case. Another set of people walking into the same room with their own version of what justice should look like. I opened the desk drawer and placed the sentencing order inside the completed file. The folder slid neatly into place. Across the courthouse, the elevator doors opened somewhere down the hall. I imagined the deputies escorting Mr. Cole through the lower corridor toward the transport van waiting outside. Metal doors, concrete walls. The sound of chains against the floor, a very different place than the courtroom he had stood in only minutes earlier. I stood and walked back toward the courtroom door. When I pushed it open, the room looked the way it always does between cases. Quiet, empty, sunlight from the tall windows fell across the jury box. The American flag behind the bench stood still. The bailiff looked up when I stepped back inside. "All set for the next hearing," he said. I nodded and walked back behind the bench. The chair rolled slightly as I sat down. For a moment, I looked out across the empty courtroom. A few hours earlier, it had been filled with jurors, lawyers, witnesses, and a man convinced probation would solve everything. Now the room had returned to its normal silence. I reached for the gavel and turned it once in my hand. Sentencing hearings are often the moment people expect the most emotion from a judge, but the bench is not a place for emotion. It's a place for decisions. Outside the courtroom doors, life keeps moving. Families leave the building. Attorneys move on to their next case. Jurors return to their jobs. But sometimes a sentence marks the exact moment someone finally understands the weight of their choices. I set the gavel back on its block. The bailiff checked the hallway one more time. Then he looked toward me. "Ready, Judge?" I closed the calendar on my desk. "Yes," I said. "Bring in the next case."